They say betrayal burns only once, but I've learned it can smolder quietly for years, like a stove left on low heat, filling the house with something you can't see, but can't quite breathe through either. He blocked my number, the woman at the phone store told me, her tone flat, routine, as if she were reading the weather. My grandson, my own blood. He blocked me the same week the loan cleared. That was the day I learned that love, the kind that's fed for decades, can vanish with the click of a button. I'm 81 years old. I live in a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Cleveland, the kind of place where you hear the neighbors' television through the wall, but never their laughter. I used to live in a real house, with a garden and curtains I sewed myself, and a porch swing where I'd rock Tyler to sleep while his mother worked the night shift. I thought I was building a future for him then. Turns out, I was just softening the ground he'd later walk away from. I remember the day he came over. It was spring, the kind of spring Ohio rarely gets right, when the sun pretends warmth but the wind still bites. He came in without knocking, taller than I remembered, smelling of some synthetic cologne and impatience. "Grandma," he said, holding my hand like it was an old receipt, something he needed but didn't really want to keep. I got into this program, business analytics, top of the field, but I need a co-signer for the student loan. They said I just need someone with good credit. Just your name on a form. You won't owe a cent, I promise. He smiled the way he used to when he was a boy and wanted an extra cookie before dinner. I remember thinking how much his eyes looked like my son's. My son who died in his 30s, who never got to ask me for anything. Maybe that's why I said yes. Not to Tyler, but to the ghost of the boy I never got to help. He had his laptop open in minutes, documents lined up like soldiers on parade. "It's all standard," he said when I hesitated at the fine print. "Everyone does it." I wanted to take my time, to read each line, but his voice pressed against me, smooth and warm and quick. "Just sign, Grandma. It's due tonight." So I did. I signed. He hugged me once, briefly, like it was a duty, and said, "I'll come by Sunday. We'll have dinner." He never did. The next time I saw his name was on a letter from the bank, polite and cold. "We regret to inform you of missed payments." I thought it was a mistake at first. I called him, and it went straight to voicemail. I texted, no answer. I sent an email, then another. 3 weeks later, I tried again, and that's when the voice from the phone store told me what he'd done. Blocked. That word felt like ice cracking underfoot. Final, fragile, deadly. It's strange how silence can get heavy. The first week I kept glancing at my phone, expecting a message. The second week I started imagining what I'd say when he finally called. How I'd tell him I wasn't angry, just disappointed. By the third week, I'd stopped leaving the house altogether. The begonias I'd planted began to wilt. I missed church twice, then 3 times. My neighbor, Shirley, knocked on my door with leftover casserole, and I pretended to nap until she went away. Shame has a sound. It hums inside the walls. It whispers that everyone must know. I couldn't bear to see the pity in their faces. I kept telling myself it wasn't really his fault. Maybe something had gone wrong. Maybe he was embarrassed. But each time the phone rang, it wasn't Tyler. It was the bank. Their voices were polite but relentless, asking for payments I couldn't make and explanations I couldn't give. I tried to hold on to the small details of the boy he'd been, the way he used to pick dandelions and call them flowers, how he'd fall asleep on my lap during thunderstorms, his little hand clutching mine as if the world depended on my pulse. I used to believe love was a rope you could keep throwing, that even if the other person let go, your end would keep them tethered somehow. But love can also be a trap if you mistake it for duty. The more I thought of him, the more I realized that I'd co-signed more than a loan. I'd co-signed my silence, my willingness to be invisible, to let the world pass through me as long as someone I loved was smiling. There were nights I'd wake up at 2 a.m, sweating, hearing Derek's voice, my husband, telling me, "You always try to save everyone, Mary." He'd said that once after I lent money to my sister that she never returned. "You think you're helping, but you're teaching them how to hurt you better." I used to think he was being cruel. Now I think he was tired of watching me give pieces of myself away. The phone would ring, and I'd stare at it until it stopped. I stopped answering unknown numbers. I stopped answering known ones too. There's a certain kind of loneliness that's not about being alone. It's about realizing the person you would call doesn't want to hear your voice. When the bank's final notice came, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at it until the edges of the paper blurred. The amount was more than I could ever pay on my fixed income. I traced my signature on the copy I'd kept. Those neat, obedient letters, written like a woman who'd never learned to say no. I thought about tearing it up, but I couldn't. I kept it pinned to the fridge as a reminder of what I'd done, not the mistake, but the reason behind it. Because love, when you strip away the sweetness, is still hunger. And sometimes, hunger makes fools of us all. People assume betrayal happens with shouting, slammed doors, angry words. Mine happened in silence, in digital ether. No explosion, no confrontation. Just a quiet disconnection that erased decades of care. He didn't steal from me violently. He simply withdrew his presence and left me with the consequences. That's what I keep coming back to. The cruelty wasn't in what he took, but in how easily he left. I've seen wars end with more ceremony than the way he slipped out of my life. Some days I still check the old photo albums. I tell myself I'm looking for strength, but really I'm searching for proof that I wasn't imagining the love, that it existed once. There's a photo of him at 6 years old, standing in front of the house with a paper crown I made out of aluminum foil. He's grinning, one front tooth missing, holding a wooden sword I carved for him out back. That boy didn't know what a credit score was. He only knew I'd never say no to him. I sometimes wonder if he remembers that version of himself, the one who believed my love could fix everything. Now I live on routines. Instant coffee in the morning, pills sorted by color, the same shows rerun at the same time. The quiet is no longer unbearable, just familiar. But sometimes, when the wind knocks a branch against the window, I hear it as a knock at the door, and for half a second I think, maybe he's come to say he's sorry. Maybe he remembers. And then I remember too. The number is blocked. The door remains closed. The stove hums softly, low heat, steady. The house is full of air I can't quite breathe, but I'm still here. And somewhere, in that persistence, there's a kind of dignity I never asked for, but maybe always needed. He came to me on a Tuesday afternoon, just before the rain started, with that look young men have when they've already decided what they're going to take, but want you to think it's your idea. I remember the sound of his car pulling up, music thudding faintly through the closed windows, that false energy of youth that fills a room before the words even begin. "Grandma, I really need your help," he said, setting his backpack down like he was settling in for a visit. He hadn't been over in months, maybe longer, but he spoke with the easy familiarity of someone who still thought the house belonged partly to him. I poured him coffee, though I didn't have milk, and I could tell by the way he barely touched it that he wasn't there for comfort, only permission. "It's for school," he said, eyes bright, voice too quick. "I got into this incredible program in Chicago. Business analytics. Top-rated. They only take 50 people. It's my shot, Grandma. But the loan, well, they said I need a co-signer, just someone with established credit. You won't have to pay anything. It's just paperwork." He said it like he was already moving on to bigger things, as if my signature was a small stepping stone on the road to his inevitable success. I wanted to ask him where his mother was in all this, but he must have anticipated it because he cut me off before the question even formed. "Mom can't," he said, shaking his head, half smiling as if it were a shared joke. "Her credit's a mess. You know how she is. You're the only one I can trust." He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine, and for a second, it was the same small hand I'd held crossing the street years ago, back when he'd insist on pressing the crosswalk button himself and would look up at me with that fierce little boy certainty that the world listened when he did. It's cruel, the way memory and manipulation can wear the same face. I remember hesitating, staring at the papers he slid toward me, all those pages dense with numbers and promises, and feeling my heart move faster for reasons I couldn't name. He spoke softly, the way you do when you're trying not to scare an animal. "It's just to help me get started, Grandma. You always told me education is everything. You said that yourself." And I had said it. 1,000 times. Because in my house, books were the only inheritance we could afford. My husband, Derek, used to say I worshipped education like some people worshipped saints, and maybe he was right. Maybe that's why I didn't stop to think about what happens when worship turns blind. He brought his laptop out then, sleek and silver, the kind that looks like it belongs to someone who already knows more than you. "It's all digital now," he said. "You just sign with your finger." I remember squinting at the screen, trying to make sense of the legalese that twisted through paragraphs like vines, but the letters blurred, and he grew impatient. "It's all standard, Grandma," he said again, that edge creeping into his voice. "You don't need to worry. Everyone does it. I'll handle the payments. You won't even notice." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe in him. So I placed my finger on the screen and watched the line appear, trembling slightly where the arthritis made my hand shake. He smiled then, that wide, easy grin that used to melt me when he was little, and said, "You just changed my life, Grandma." I didn't know he meant mine too. After he left, I stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the street. The rain starting to patter softly against the glass. I felt proud, even relieved, like I had done something good, something that mattered. The house felt warmer somehow, filled with the ghost of his voice. I made myself tea, humming a little, remembering the times he'd sit at this very table doing his homework while I cooked dinner. He'd ask me what words meant. Big ones like resilient and integrity. And I'd smile, thinking the future would be safe in his hands. It's strange how easily pride can disguise itself as love, how it makes you blind to the tremor beneath the calm. 2 weeks later, the first letter arrived, confirmation of the loan approval. My name was there, printed clearly beneath his. I traced it with my finger, that small, fragile proof of trust, not yet realizing it was a rope binding me to something heavy and sinking. There were numbers, too, huge ones, and dates I didn't understand, but I told myself it didn't matter. I folded the paper neatly, put it in the drawer beside my tax receipts, and told myself I'd done a grandmother's duty. That's what we do, isn't it? We stand behind them, hold them up, believe in them long after reason tells us not to. I didn't see him again for a while. When I called to check in, he answered once, quick and distracted. Said he was settling into classes, that everything was going great. His voice sounded different, older maybe, or just distant. I asked when he'd come for dinner and he said, "Soon, Grandma. Just busy right now." Then the line clicked. I didn't hear from him after that. But I wasn't worried, not yet. I told myself he was just finding his footing, that young people have to build their own lives. You have to let them go. You have to trust they'll find their way back. What I didn't know then was that trust can be a dangerous currency when you're the only one spending it. The first real sign came from the tone of the second letter, a formal one from the bank, informing me that the borrower's account has entered the repayment phase. The language was neutral, but it carried the weight of obligation. I called the number listed and waited on hold for 40 minutes, listening to a looping piano melody that made my stomach ache. When someone finally answered, I gave them my name, my details, and said I was calling on behalf of my grandson. "He's missed 2 payments," the woman said, her voice brisk but not unkind. "As the co-signer, you're equally responsible." The words felt like cold water down my spine. I told her there must be some mistake, that he was a good boy, that he was probably just late. She said she understood, but the system didn't. Systems never do. That night I called him again, over and over, until the phone went straight to voicemail. I texted. I emailed. I even reached out to his mother, who sighed and said, "Mom, I told you not to get involved. You can't save him from himself." I wanted to argue, but there was nothing left to say. The next morning, I walked to the post office and mailed him a letter. 3 pages, handwritten, careful. I didn't scold him. I just reminded him of who I was, of who we were. I told him I loved him, that I believed in him, that all he had to do was call. I never got an answer. When I think of it now, I realize the betrayal didn't happen when he stopped paying. It happened the moment I signed that screen. The betrayal was in the space between what he asked for and what I thought he was asking for. He wanted money. I thought he wanted faith. And I gave it to him freely, not realizing that some forms of love have interest rates too high for anyone to afford. The next few months blurred into one long stretch of waiting. The phone rang almost daily, the bank's voice becoming a fixture in my life, polite, persistent, unavoidable. I started to recognize the numbers, the area codes, even the pauses between rings. I tried to make small payments just to keep them at bay, pulling from the little savings Derek had left me, each transaction feeling like another admission of guilt. Sometimes I'd whisper his name, as if saying it softly could summon the boy I'd once known, the one who used to run barefoot through my backyard chasing fireflies. But all that ever came back was the hollow hum of the phone line. I began to sense the shift slowly, the way you feel the temperature drop before a storm. There were days when I almost convinced myself he'd come back, that it was all a misunderstanding, that we'd sit down over tea and sort it out. But hope is its own kind of blindness, and I wore it like armor, not realizing how thin it had become. The rain came harder that spring, and I'd watch it streak down the windows, wondering where he was, whether he ever thought of me, or if I'd simply become another name he needed to erase to move forward. Sometimes I imagine the moment he decided to block me, the stillness before he pressed the button, the small flick of his finger that made me disappear. Did he hesitate? Did he feel even a flicker of shame? Or was it like deleting a spam message? Easy. Necessary. Forgettable? I'll never know. But I do know this. That was the moment everything changed. The signature that once felt like a promise became a wound, and every call from the bank was its echo. And somewhere in that endless silence between us, something broke that no apology could ever fix. The days began to blur together after that. Long stretches of quiet where the air itself felt thick with waiting. I tried to keep up my small routines, folding laundry even when there was nothing dirty, washing dishes twice just for the sound of the water. The phone would ring, and I'd let it. I knew the voice that waited on the other side, the same polite woman from the collections department, always beginning the same way. "Mrs. McClure, we're calling to remind you of your upcoming payment." She never raised her voice, never showed anger. Her calmness was the cruelest part. It made the whole thing sound ordinary, like she was reminding me about an appointment I had agreed to. I'd sit with the phone in my hand after each call, staring at the reflection of my own face in the dark screen, and think, this is how people disappear, not all at once, but in small permissions. One signature, one ignored call, one more month of pretending everything's fine. I told no one. My daughter and I had grown distant over the years, our conversations reduced to birthdays and weather reports. She was proud of being practical, of not letting feelings drag her down. When I mentioned just once that Tyler had missed some payments, her sigh came through the line like a door closing. "Mom, you should have known better," she said. Her voice clipped, her affection rationed. "He's irresponsible. You can't fix that." And just like that, I stopped trying to talk about it. It was easier to shoulder the shame alone than to hear it reflected in someone else's voice. At night, I'd sit in the living room with the television on low, not watching, just letting the flicker of light move across the walls. The house had become too quiet. Even the refrigerator's hum seemed louder. Sometimes I'd think I heard footsteps on the porch and would glance up, heart quickening, only to see the empty walkway outside. I used to love the quiet when Derek was alive. We'd read together, the silence between us soft and full. Now it pressed against me like a weight, filling every space Tyler had once occupied. The first time the late notice came in red ink, I felt a strange mixture of panic and defiance. I held the envelope up to the light, as if the words could change if I refused to read them properly. When I finally opened it, the numbers swam in front of my eyes. The amount was growing. I paid what I could, small payments, barely enough to make a dent, but each one drained something deeper than my account. I started cutting corners, bought cheaper groceries, canceled the magazine subscription I'd had since my 30s, kept the heat low even when my hands went stiff from the cold. I told myself it was temporary, that Tyler would straighten things out soon. But as the weeks turned to months, hope began to taste like humiliation. There's a peculiar kind of loneliness that comes from being deceived by someone you raised. It's not just sadness, it's a dismantling. Every memory becomes suspect. I'd look at old photographs and see warning signs that weren't there, moments that now felt poisoned. I remembered him asking for small things when he was young, $5 for a school trip, a new pair of sneakers, and how I'd always said yes, even when money was tight. I wanted to give him the things I never had. Maybe that was my mistake, confusing generosity with love, thinking I could fill the emptiness of my own childhood by giving him everything. One afternoon, I went to the grocery store and my card was declined. The cashier, a young girl with blue hair and chipped nail polish, looked at me with that particular brand of pity that feels like a slap. "It's probably just a glitch," she said, too brightly. I wanted to explain, to tell her about the loan, about how I was trying to fix things, but I couldn't make my mouth form the words. Instead, I smiled, left the groceries, and walked out into the parking lot. I sat in my car for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel, and for the first time, I let the truth settle over me like a physical thing. He wasn't coming back. He wasn't calling. He wasn't even thinking about me. That night, I went through the house collecting small things that reminded me of him. The baseball cap he left once. The card he made in 4th grade that said, "Best grandma ever." A photo from his graduation where he's half turned away, already impatient for the next thing. I put them all in a shoebox and slid it to the back of the closet. It wasn't anger that made me do it. It was survival. I needed space to breathe again, and his ghost was taking up too much air. The calls didn't stop. They became part of my days, as regular as meals. Sometimes the voices changed. New collectors, new tones, but the message was always the same. I began to recognize the rhythm of their scripts, the pauses meant to sound empathetic, the firmness beneath the politeness. I'd answer sometimes, just to hear a voice, even if it was the voice of someone reminding me of my failures. Once I tried to explain, to tell one of them that it wasn't really my debt, that my grandson had promised, that I was tricked. The woman on the other end sighed and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your name is on the document." That phrase, "your name is on it," echoed in my head for days. I started to hate my own handwriting, the way I loop my M's too neatly, like someone trying too hard to be good. I began avoiding the mirror, not out of vanity, but because I didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her eyes seemed smaller, her shoulders stooped. There was a dullness around the mouth, the kind that comes from swallowing too many words. I wondered when I had become so easy to betray. Was it age? Loneliness? Or had I been training people all my life to see me as someone who would always say yes? Derek used to tease me for being soft-hearted. He'd say, "Mary, one day someone's going to use that kindness of yours to build themselves a ladder and climb right over you." I'd laugh then, but now it didn't seem funny. Around that time, I stopped answering the phone altogether. I let the answering machine fill up, then unplugged it. The silence was worse, but at least it was mine. I'd wake up early, make tea, and sit by the window, watching the neighborhood move without me. School buses, joggers, couples walking dogs. The world kept going, indifferent to my quiet unraveling. I started talking to Derek's photograph more often, telling him about the bills, the loneliness, the absurdity of it all. I did it out of love, I'd say. Can that still be wrong? His smile in the picture never changed, but I imagined he understood. Sometimes I'd catch myself daydreaming that Tyler would show up one day, contrite, holding flowers, ready to make things right. I'd imagine the conversation we'd have, how he'd say he'd made a mistake, how I'd tell him I forgave him, and we'd both cry. Those fantasies were my only relief, even as I knew they were lies. Hope can be crueler than grief. It keeps you awake longer. As the months dragged on, my savings dwindled. I started counting out pills to stretch the prescription longer, buying canned food instead of fresh. The smallest decisions became negotiations with myself. How much heat I could afford. How many lights I really needed on. I'd sit in the dim living room and listen to the ticking of the clock. Each second, a reminder of time passing without change. every ring of the phone felt like judgment. Every unopened envelope another secret I was too afraid to confront. I tried to pray. Not for forgiveness. There was no sin in love. But for clarity. For some understanding of how a bond that had once been so pure could curdle into this quiet cruelty. The prayers came out tangled, half memory, half plea. I told God I could accept loss, but not this kind of erasure. Not being rewritten as foolish, as naive. I wanted to be seen again, even if only by the heavens. But the sky outside stayed blank, and the only answer I ever heard was the rustle of bills sliding through the mail slot. Another reminder that I was still accountable for a debt that wasn't truly mine. One evening, I found myself standing by the front door, holding my purse as if I were about to go somewhere, though I had nowhere to be. The sun was setting, that washed-out gold that makes everything look almost beautiful, and I thought of Tyler as a boy, running barefoot through the yard, chasing bubbles I blew for him. He'd laugh so hard he'd fall over, then look at me like I'd given him the world. That look had kept me alive once. Now it haunted me. I whispered his name out loud, just to feel it in the air, and in that moment, I realized something I hadn't before. I was still waiting for him, waiting for the boy he used to be, not the man he had become. And that waiting, that endless, unreciprocated hope, was its own kind of debt. One I had been paying all my life without ever signing for it. It was a Wednesday morning in late autumn, when something inside me began to shift, though at first I didn't recognize it for what it was. The air was heavy with the smell of rain, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through another pile of envelopes I didn't want to open. They had begun arriving almost daily now, thin, official, merciless. I would stack them neatly, as if order could somehow undo the chaos they contained. But that morning, I saw my reflection in the window. A small, stooped woman in a faded cardigan, her hands trembling slightly as she touched each letter as though it might burn her. And for the first time, I saw how small I had become, not just in body, but in spirit. I had folded myself down to fit inside the silence that had grown between me and my grandson. I realized, with a kind of dull horror, that I had been living as if waiting for permission to exist again. The kettle whistled, and I poured the water absent-mindedly into a mug that still had a chip on the rim. It was one Tyler had given me years ago from some school trip, with a cartoon bear and the words, "World's Best Grandma." I used to smile every time I saw it. Now it just felt like a lie printed in fading ink. I thought about throwing it away, but I couldn't. I didn't know if that was love or weakness, but either way, I wasn't ready to let go. I carried the mug to the table and stared at it as though it might start talking. The house was so quiet it felt like being underwater. Even my own breathing sounded like a noise I should apologize for. I opened one of the envelopes, finally, and began to read the letter inside. It was from a debt collector, though phrased in the kind of polite cruelty that corporations have mastered. They thanked me for my continued cooperation and reminded me of the consequences of non-payment. The word consequences stood out in bold, heavy letters. I imagined the person who wrote it, someone young, maybe sitting in a bright office, sipping coffee, unaware that their words landed like stones in the stomachs of people like me. I don't know why, but I suddenly felt a strange calm. I took a pen from the drawer and began writing on the back of the letter, not to them, but to myself. I wrote, "You are not a victim. You are not invisible. You are not done yet." It wasn't anger that moved my hand. It was something quieter and older, something closer to exhaustion, but sharper, like a blade dulled by years of use, finally remembering what it was made for. I realized I had spent most of my life saying yes to my husband, to my children, to my job, to my church, and every yes had been a small surrender dressed as love. I had always believed that kindness meant sacrifice. But that morning, staring at the ink drying on the paper, I saw how wrong I'd been. Kindness without boundaries isn't virtue, it's erasure. After I wrote that, I stood up, put on my coat, and walked outside for the first time in weeks. The air bit at my cheeks, and I felt dizzy, unused to the weight of my own body moving forward. I didn't have a plan. I just walked. Past the houses with their trimmed lawns, past the bus stop where children waited with backpacks too big for their shoulders, past the corner store where I used to buy Tyler his favorite candy. The cashier, an older man who sometimes gave me free apples, waved, but I couldn't bring myself to wave back. My hands were cold, but I felt alive, alert in a way I hadn't for months. I ended up at the small park 2 blocks away, the one with the rusted swings and the crooked bench under a maple tree. I sat down and watched the wind pull the last of the leaves from the branches. There was something comforting about the bareness of it, the way the tree stood exposed but unbroken. A young man was sitting on the next bench, typing on a laptop. He glanced up once, smiled politely, and went back to his work. I wanted to hate him for his ease, for the confidence of youth, but instead, I found myself thinking of Tyler. I imagined him sitting like that somewhere, tapping away, living a life that had no space left for me. The thought used to hurt. Now it just felt factual, like the weather. I sat there for a long time, until the cold began to seep through my coat, and then I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked into the local library. The woman behind the counter looked surprised to see me. I told her I needed to use a computer, and she led me to one near the back. The keys were stiff, the screen faintly smudged, but when it lit up, I felt something ignite in me too. I typed, "How to protect yourself from debt collectors," and pressed enter. The results flooded the screen. Articles, forums, legal resources, things I had never even known existed. My heart raced as I scrolled. There was a free legal aid office downtown, it said, that helped senior citizens in financial distress. I copied down the number on a scrap of paper. It was the first time in months I had written something that wasn't an apology. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was full of voices, not the haunting kind that had kept me company before, but the kind that urged me forward. I rehearsed what I'd say when I called. I imagined the person on the other end. A stranger, yes, but maybe one who would listen. The next morning I made the call. My voice shook at first, but the woman who answered was patient. She asked questions, took notes, and told me to come in with all the documents I had. "We'll sort it out together," she said. Together. I hadn't heard that word in so long that I nearly cried. When I arrived at the office the following week, I expected cold indifference, but what I found was a room filled with quiet compassion. A young lawyer named Tanisha took my case. She looked at me the way people rarely do, with directness, not pity. She explained what could be done, what couldn't, and for the first time, I understood the shape of my own predicament. She showed me how to write formal letters to the bank, how to request documentation, how to demand they stop harassing me. The language was powerful, clinical, and it felt strange to see my name attached to words like dispute and rights. I signed those letters with a steadier hand than I'd used in years. Walking out of that office, I felt taller somehow, though nothing about my body had changed. I could breathe deeper. The sky seemed clearer, even though the day was gray. I realized then that I had been waiting for someone, anyone, to rescue me, when all along what I needed was to remember I still could stand on my own. It didn't erase the hurt. It didn't make Tyler's betrayal any smaller. But it gave me back something I hadn't even noticed was missing: my own authority. That evening, I sat by the window again, but this time I didn't feel trapped behind the glass. The world outside looked less distant. I opened the drawer where I kept his letters and the bills and began sorting through them. For the first time, I didn't cry. I felt something close to clarity instead. Each paper told a story, not of loss, but of choices, of where I had let others write my life for me. I realized I could start a new page, maybe not free of debt, but free of blindness. I made a small list that night. Things I would no longer do. I wouldn't answer every call. I wouldn't apologize for surviving. I wouldn't measure my worth by what I could give. I wouldn't mistake silence for peace. It was a short list, but it felt monumental. I folded it neatly and placed it under the chipped mug, the one that still said, "World's Best Grandma." The words didn't sting anymore. They were just words. The truth was larger, and I was beginning to live it. The next morning, the phone rang again, that same unknown number. I looked at it, let it ring twice, then picked it up. The voice started its usual script, but this time I interrupted. "You'll speak to my lawyer from now on," I said. Steady, clear. There was a pause, and then the line clicked off. I stood there, holding the silent phone, and laughed softly to myself. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was recognition. The sound of my own voice finally belonging to me again. I knew the fight wasn't over. There would be more letters, more bureaucratic battles, more nights when doubt would crawl back into my bed. But I also knew this: the woman who had signed that loan was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned at last that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just decides to stop apologizing. And that decision, quiet as it was, felt like the first true act of freedom I'd made in years. It was about 6 weeks after that first visit to the legal aid office when the past came to my door, carrying flowers from the grocery store and an apology rehearsed too neatly to be real. I remember the sound of the car before I even saw him, the low, restless hum of a borrowed engine, the kind that idles too long because the driver doesn't know whether to stay or run. I had been in the living room, watering the plant by the window, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and the faint slam of a door. Something inside me froze, the way a body remembers danger even before the mind does. I didn't move right away. I waited, listening. Then came the knock. 3 quick taps, uncertain, then silence. I looked through the thin lace curtain and saw him standing there, taller, thinner, his face half-shadowed by the afternoon sun. He was holding a cheap bouquet wrapped in plastic. Pink carnations, the kind that wilt before you can get them into water. My first thought wasn't anger. It was recognition of how small he suddenly seemed. My second thought was that I didn't want him inside my house. He knocked again, softer this time. "Grandma? It's me. Tyler." His voice had changed since the last time I heard it in person. There was a low roughness to it, something like guilt or exhaustion, though I didn't trust my ability to tell the difference anymore. I stood still for a long time before answering. "What do you want?" I called through the door. My voice surprised me. It was steady, without the tremor that used to betray me when I was hurt. He hesitated. I wanted to see you. to talk. The words were awkward, hanging in the space between us like laundry on a cold day, damp, half frozen, never quite drying. I didn't open the main door, only the screen one, keeping that thin mesh between us as if it could filter the lies from the air. Up close, he looked older than his 20-something years, with the kind of tiredness that comes from running away too long. His eyes darted around the porch, never quite meeting mine. "You look good, Grandma," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I didn't return it. "You owe a lot of people money," I said instead. The bluntness startled even me, but it felt necessary, like ripping gauze off a wound that had festered too long. He sighed and shifted his weight, the flowers crinkling in his hand. "I know. I messed up. I didn't mean for things to get this bad. I just needed time." "Time for what?" I asked. "To disappear? To let strangers call me every morning for a debt I didn't make?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. I could see the small twitch of his jaw, the stubbornness that had once been charming when he was 5 and refused to eat vegetables, but now looked like cowardice dressed as pride. "I thought I could fix it," he said finally. "I thought I'd get a better job, pay it off before you even noticed." He glanced up then, searching my face for the softness he used to find there. He didn't find it. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain. I noticed his hands were shaking slightly, the way mine used to when the collectors called. Maybe he was scared. Maybe he just wanted me to think he was. "Why now?" I asked. "After months of silence?" His eyes flickered. "I felt ashamed," he said. "I didn't know how to face you." It was almost convincing, the way his voice broke at the edges. But shame isn't silence. Shame tries. What he felt was avoidance, polished until it could pass for remorse. I'd spent too many years mistaking the two. He stepped closer to the door, and I saw then how different he really was from the boy I remembered. The boy had been messy and bright and full of noise. The man standing in front of me was smaller somehow, hollowed out by his own shortcuts. "Grandma, I just need a little more time. I'm working now, I swear. I can start making payments soon." I wanted to ask him if he thought time would erase the months of fear he'd left me with, if he thought debt collectors could be reasoned with by promises of soon. Instead, I said, "You blocked my number." His face tightened. "I didn't mean to. You did," I interrupted. "You decided you didn't want to hear my voice." The words came out quieter than I expected, but they landed like a weight between us. He put the flowers down on the porch railing, a small act of surrender, or maybe just of fatigue. "I'm sorry," he said again, but the word had lost its meaning. I'd heard it too many times from too many mouths. I looked at those flowers, at the plastic wrapping fogged with his breath, and I felt something unfamiliar. Pity, maybe, but without warmth. I realized that forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't something you give to make someone else feel better. It's something you reclaim to stop them from owning any more of your pain. "I've spoken to a lawyer," I said. "You'll be hearing from them." He blinked, confusion crossing his face. "What? Why would you—" "Grandma, I'm your family." That word, family, hit me harder than I expected. It had always been my anchor, the reason for everything. But in that moment, it sounded like a weapon. How many times had people used it to keep me quiet, to make me give, to make me stay small? I shook my head. Family doesn't take your name and turn it into a burden. Family doesn't hide behind silence. His eyes darkened. For a brief moment, I saw anger there, the kind that comes when charm no longer works. "You're really going to do this?" he asked. "To me?" His tone changed, sharpened, the apology dissolving into entitlement. That's when I knew the visit wasn't about remorse. It was about control. He wanted to make sure I was still pliable, still the soft grandmother who would fix things quietly. "I'm not doing anything to you," I said. "I'm just done doing things for you." The sentence came out clean, like a truth finally spoken after years of hesitation. He stared at me, his mouth opening slightly, then closing. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the realization that the old woman in front of him was no longer the same one he'd left behind. He tried one more time, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I just thought you'd understand." I felt a bitter smile pull at my mouth. "I do understand," I said. "That's why I can't let you in." Then I closed the screen door and walked away. He stood there for a while. I could hear his footsteps pacing the porch, the rustle of the plastic bouquet, and then, finally, the sound of his car pulling away. I waited until the engine noise faded before I sat down. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was something else. A release, maybe. The kind that comes when the truth finally settles where it belongs. I stared at the flowers he'd left behind. For a moment, I considered throwing them out, but instead, I put them in a vase and left them on the porch. I wanted them to wilt where he had stood. The next few days passed in a strange quiet. I expected anger, sadness, something heavy. But what I felt was a kind of hollow peace. The lawyer called to update me. The case was moving forward. The bank had agreed to a review of the documentation. She said there was a chance I could be released from some of the liability, depending on how the terms were written. It wasn't certain, but it was hope shaped like action, and that was more than I'd had in months. Still, I couldn't shake the image of Tyler's face at the door, that flicker of desperation when he realized I wasn't bending anymore. I wondered if he'd meant any of it, the apology, the fear, the flowers. I wondered if I even needed to know. But life, as it does, had its own timing. 2 weeks later, I came home from the grocery store to find another envelope wedged in the doorframe. No return address, just my name written in a hand I recognized instantly. Inside was a check, small, barely a fraction of what was owed, and a folded note. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I know this doesn't fix it. I'll do better. I promise." I stared at the words until they blurred. There was no address, no number, no way to reply. Just that promise, hanging in the empty space between apology and responsibility. I took the check, placed it on the table, and sat for a long time, thinking about what to do with it. In the end, I cashed it. Not because it made a difference financially, but because I decided the money could serve a better purpose. I used it to buy something small but beautiful, a cane carved from walnut wood with a brass handle shaped like a bird in flight. It felt solid in my hand, balanced, elegant. Every time I leaned on it, I remembered that standing doesn't always mean standing tall. It sometimes just means refusing to fall. That cane became a quiet symbol of something I hadn't known I'd lost. My dignity. A few weeks later, I saw Tyler again, though not in person. It was on social media, of all things. His mother had shown me the photo on her phone, not realizing it would sting. He was smiling, arm around a young woman, standing in front of a restaurant. He looked happy. Free. There was no sign of regret in his face, no hint of the wreckage he'd left behind. For a moment, the old ache returned. The part of me that still wanted to believe he could come back. Say the right words. Mean them this time. But then I thought of the screen door closing, of the quiet that followed, and I felt only relief. I realized I didn't need him to be sorry for me to heal. I just needed him to stop taking up space in my story. Sometimes at night, I still think about that day on the porch. The sound of the flowers brushing against the railing, the way his voice cracked when he said my name. But instead of grief, what I feel now is something closer to gratitude. Because that was the moment I saw him clearly, not the boy I had loved, not the man I'd hoped he would become, but the truth of him. Flawed, frightened, and not mine to save. It was also the moment I saw myself clearly. The woman who had spent her life saying yes, finally learning that no is not cruelty. It's self-respect, spoken aloud. The bank still calls sometimes, though less now. I let the phone ring. When I answer, it's on my terms. The house is still small, still quiet, but the silence no longer feels like punishment. It feels earned. When I pass the mirror now, I stop and look. The woman there is still aging, still scarred by years of loving too deeply. But she's standing upright, cane in hand, eyes steady. And in that reflection, I see not loss, but arrival. Because sometimes the road to peace runs straight through betrayal, and sometimes, when the person you love most breaks you, what's left isn't emptiness at all. It's the raw material of who you were always meant to be. That's what the second escalation really was, though I didn't have words for it then. It wasn't just him returning. It was the test of whether I would crumble again or stand, whether I'd choose the comfort of old pain or the risk of a new self. And when I closed that door, it wasn't anger that guided me. It was clarity. The realization that love, when unreturned, becomes a cage, and that sometimes freedom means walking away from the very person you once swore you'd never abandon. The climax, if I can even call it that, did not arrive with noise or confrontation, or any of the grand gestures that make people feel they have witnessed a reckoning. It came instead in a plain white envelope, the kind that could have carried anything from a bill to a birthday card, slipped under my door one quiet morning in early March. I had woken to the sound of wind scraping against the window panes, the kind of wind that makes you feel the house itself is breathing, and I shuffled to the door, half expecting to see another advertisement, another reminder of something I couldn't afford. But when I picked up the envelope and turned it over in my hands, I saw that it had been mailed from a law office, the one my lawyer, Tanisha, had mentioned during our last phone call. Inside was a single-page notice confirming that the bank had accepted a partial settlement and that the remainder of the balance, the portion I could not possibly pay, had been discharged due to evidence of misrepresentation by the borrower. I read it 3 times before I believed what it said. Then I sat down in the chair by the window and let the paper rest on my lap, too stunned even to cry. For months I had lived with the weight of that debt pressing against my chest, invisible but constant, dictating every decision I made. And now, just like that, it was gone. Not the pain, not the betrayal, but the institution's grip around my throat. I thought I would feel triumphant. Instead, what washed over me was something quieter, older, like the exhale after a long-held breath. I felt small and steady, like a tree that has outlasted the storm not by strength but by refusal to fall. I thought about calling Tyler, about telling him that it was done, that the account was closed, and his name now carried a shadow that would follow him longer than any apology could reach. But the thought dissolved almost as soon as it appeared. There was nothing left to say. What could I possibly tell him? That I had finally undone part of the damage he had caused. that I had learned to navigate a world built on fine print and loopholes that preyed on trust, that the love I had for him still existed, but it now belonged to a version of him that no longer walked the earth. Words would have made it smaller, and I was done shrinking things to make them easier for other people to hold. Still, the act of liberation demanded something tangible, something to mark its presence in the world beyond paperwork. I found myself opening the window, letting the wind tear through the stale air of the house. On the table sat a stack of letters from the bank. Warnings, demands, reminders of every night I had spent tracing numbers I didn't understand. I gathered them all, every last one, tied them together with a piece of old twine, and carried them outside. The yard was wet from the night's rain, the earth soft beneath my slippers. I placed the stack in a metal basin and struck a match. The paper caught slowly at first, curling in on itself, ink bleeding into flame, and then it blazed, a soft, fierce orange that lit my hands and face. The smoke rose into the air, carrying away months of humiliation, each sheet collapsing into ash like a memory being rewritten. I didn't think of it as revenge or even ritual. It was simply necessary. Some burdens can't be filed away. They have to be burned. I watched until the last ember faded, then stood there in the cool morning, the smell of smoke clinging to my cardigan. My hands were shaking, not from fear this time, but from a strange lightness. I realized that for the first time in over a year, I wasn't afraid of the mailman, or the phone, or the silence. I was no longer waiting for anything to happen to me. I was happening to myself again. That realization came with an ache, too, because it meant accepting that the love I had built my life around, the one I had poured into family, into being the dependable one, the safe one, was something I would have to redirect. Love, I realized, had to go somewhere, and if it wasn't going toward him anymore, it had to come back toward me. The following week, I took a bus downtown, something I hadn't done in years. My legs were unsteady, but I had my cane, the walnut one with the brass bird perched proudly on top. The bus was half empty, filled with the quiet murmur of people going nowhere urgent. I sat by the window and watched the city slide past, familiar and distant all at once. When I reached the courthouse, I went inside, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I wanted to see the place where my name had been both a liability and a victory. Tanisha met me there, smiling, waving a copy of the final paperwork like a flag. "You're officially free," she said. Her eyes were bright, proud. "They can't come after you anymore." We sat together on a bench in the hallway, two women from different worlds, connected by this small act of survival. I told her she reminded me of my daughter when she was young, sharp, impatient, unafraid to take up space. She laughed and said I reminded her of her grandmother, the one who taught her that silence was only ever useful when it was strategic. "You didn't just win a case," she said. "You reclaimed your name." The words stayed with me, echoing in my head long after I left the building. Reclaimed my name. The same name that had once felt like a curse now felt like something I could carry again, not because it was unblemished, but because it was mine. That afternoon when I got home, I found a new message on my phone. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice was not. "Hi, Grandma. It's me. I heard from Mom about the loan. I just wanted to say..." There was a pause, a shallow breath. "I'm glad it's over. I'm sorry it went that way." The message ended abruptly, as if he couldn't decide what else to say. I stood there, listening to it twice, 3 times, waiting for the old reflex to kick in, the urge to forgive, to reach out, to comfort. But it didn't come. The apology hung in the air, weightless. I deleted the message without saving it. Not in anger, but in acceptance. Some things don't need closure from the other person. They just need distance. That night, I cooked a real meal for myself for the first time in months. Nothing fancy. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans sautéed with garlic. I set the table with the good dishes, the ones I used to save for holidays, and poured myself a small glass of wine. The food tasted different, sharper, as if my body had finally remembered what nourishment felt like. I sat there in the quiet, eating slowly, letting the warmth spread through me. When I finished, I looked around the room. The faded wallpaper, the worn edges of the table, the vase of dried carnations still sitting by the window, and felt something I hadn't felt since before all this began. Safety. Later, I took out my old sewing kit, the one I hadn't touched in years, and began mending a tear in my cardigan. The rhythmic pull of the thread through fabric felt grounding, almost sacred. As I worked, I thought about all the ways I had been taught to endure. Through patience, through forgiveness, through silence, and how endurance alone is not the same as living. To live, I realized, is to act. Even if the action is as small as saying no, as deliberate as refusing to be erased. Before bed, I wrote a letter. Not to Tyler, not to the bank, but to myself. I wrote about the morning the letter came, about the fire in the basin, about the way the world looked different when the fear began to lift. I wrote about the woman I had been before all this, the one who mistook compliance for love, and the woman I was now, cautious but unbroken. I wrote, "You did not lose him. You released him. You did not fail. You survived." I folded the letter and placed it inside my Bible, between Psalms and Proverbs, where all the words about forgiveness and wisdom live side by side. It felt fitting somehow that my own words belonged there too. The next morning, I went outside and stood on the porch. The air was cool, the sky washed clean after rain. I watched the sun rise over the rooftops, a pale, steady light creeping into the edges of the world. I thought of Derek, of my daughter, of Tyler, not as wounds, but as threads, all part of the same fabric that had carried me here. I tapped my cane once on the wooden boards and smiled. The sound was firm, certain. It was the sound of continuation. The climax of my story wasn't the legal victory, or even the moment I burned those letters. It was the quiet decision that followed. To keep living as a woman who has nothing left to prove. To inhabit my own life fully, without apology, without permission. It was the realization that dignity doesn't come from being untouched by harm. It comes from refusing to let harm define you. I had been broken, yes, but I had also built myself again, piece by piece, not into the woman I once was, but into someone who had finally stopped mistaking survival for shame. When I went back inside, the house felt lighter, as though it too had been freed. The wind through the open window carried the faint scent of smoke from some distant chimney, and I thought of how fire can destroy and cleanse at once. I sat down at the table, placed my hands flat against the wood, and whispered to the empty room, "It's over." Not as a plea, but as a fact. Then I poured myself another cup of tea and began, quietly, to plan the rest of my life. The quiet that followed did not feel like the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the quiet of something complete, something that had finished breaking and was now settling back into its shape. The days stretched long and calm, each one with a rhythm I had forgotten how to trust. Morning light slid across the kitchen table, catching on the rim of my teacup, and I found myself sitting there longer than I used to, not waiting for a phone call or a letter, not measuring time by absence. The debt was gone, the fear was gone, and in their place was a stillness that felt earned. I had not known, until then, that peace could be so physical. It lived in my hands, in my shoulders, in the way I no longer started when the phone rang. It lived in the space I reclaimed inside my own body, the space where shame had been living like a tenant that refused to leave. I began taking walks again, slow ones around the block, leaning on the walnut cane with its brass bird glinting in the sunlight. The neighbors waved more now, perhaps sensing something different in my posture, perhaps seeing a woman who was no longer carrying a secret weight. One afternoon, the young volunteer from the church, the one who brings food for the shut-ins, stopped by and asked if I'd come to help with the spring bake sale. I almost said no out of habit, but then I thought, why not? It had been months since I'd stood in the church kitchen, months since I'd felt the warmth of ovens and the smell of sugar in the air. I said yes, and it felt like a small victory. The day of the sale, I wore my blue cardigan and a pair of earrings I hadn't touched since Derek passed. The church hall was full of noise, laughter, and that hum of polite chaos that only women of a certain age can manage. Measuring cups clattering, trays being shuffled, someone calling for more frosting. I stood at the long table icing cookies, my hands steady, my breath even. Across the room, I saw a girl about 16, shy and quiet, working alone at a mixing bowl. She reminded me of myself at that age, careful, invisible. I went over and started talking to her. Nothing grand, just the small conversation of strangers, school, music, favorite desserts. When she smiled, her face softened into something open, trusting. I told her, gently, that she shouldn't ever let anyone make her smaller, just to keep the peace. She looked at me with that cautious curiosity teenagers have when they hear truth spoken in a voice they still want to trust. I didn't tell her my story. She didn't need the details. Sometimes the lesson survives better without the wound attached. In the weeks that followed, I found my life filling with small human rituals again. I baked for myself, not for anyone else's comfort. I wrote letters to old friends, not to confess or apologize, but simply to say I was still here. I planted begonias in the front yard, red and pink, their colors too loud for the modest house, but perfectly right for the woman who now lived inside it. And slowly, without meaning to, I began to forgive. Not Tyler exactly, but the version of myself who had let him hurt me. Forgiveness turned out to be less like opening a door and more like letting go of a rope I'd been gripping too long. My palms were sore from holding on. When I finally released it, the quiet that followed was not emptiness, but rest. Every now and then, I still think of him. I picture him walking through some city street, perhaps holding that same cheap bouquet for someone else, perhaps learning, in his own clumsy way, that love is not something you take to prove you're loved in return. I hope he finds something steady, something real. But I no longer wait for news of him, no longer check the phone for his name. My love for him has become something private, something without demand. Love that is no longer an open wound, but a healed scar that tells the story of its own closing. One evening, near the end of summer, I sat on the porch as the light turned gold and the air cooled. The cane rested against my chair, and the air smelled faintly of cut grass and rain. I thought of all the years I had spent defining myself through others, through their needs, their chaos, their gratitude or lack of it. It struck me that this stage of life, the one everyone calls decline, can also be a beginning if you choose to see it that way. The beginning of sovereignty, the beginning of quiet self-possession, the beginning of a woman who belongs only to herself. I keep the discharge letter framed now, not because I care about the financial victory, but because it reminds me that even the smallest acts of courage leave a mark. It hangs near the kitchen, next to an old photograph of Derek and me in our garden. He is smiling, holding a basket of tomatoes. I look at it sometimes and imagine telling him everything that has happened, how I lost almost everything, but somehow came out clearer, steadier, maybe even stronger. I think he would understand. He always said I underestimated my own endurance. He used to tell me, "You bend, Mary, but you never break." I used to laugh when he said that. Now I know he was right. There is a kind of freedom that comes only after ruin, the freedom to stop performing resilience and simply live it. I no longer feel the need to explain myself or to prove that I've healed. Healing is not a performance. It's the quiet act of waking up each morning and deciding to keep choosing your own peace. That's what I do now. I wake up, make my coffee, water my flowers, and remind myself that this life, this small, ordinary life, is mine. Finally, entirely mine. If you, whoever you are, ever find yourself standing where I once stood, trembling, ashamed, believing that love requires you to disappear, listen to me. You are allowed to draw a line. You are allowed to be kind without being consumed. You are allowed to love someone and still walk away. You can say no and still be good. You can let go and still be whole. I am 81 years old, and for the first time in my life, I do not owe anyone an explanation. The phone rings sometimes and I let it. The world goes on making its demands, but I answer only to myself now. I live alone, but I am not lonely. The quiet is mine. The house is mine. My name, once used against me, belongs to me again. I sleep through the night without dreaming of debts or apologies. I wake to sunlight spilling across the floor, and I whisper a small truth into the air, not for anyone else to hear, but simply because it feels good to say it aloud. I survived. And that, after everything, is enough.